In the years when the air itself seemed cursed, when bells rang so often for the dead that their sound lost meaning, something strange began to appear on the walls of Europe. It was not carved by invaders or painted to celebrate victory. It emerged, quietly, almost politely, in the shadowed places where grief had already settled. Skeletons took each other by the hand, skulls leaned close as if whispering jokes, and death ancient, inevitable death began to smile. The Middle Ages had always lived beside the grave, but the 14th century erased the distance entirely. The Black Death moved like a breath across the continent, unseen and unstoppable. Streets emptied. Entire villages fell silent so quickly that doors were left open, meals untouched. The living learned to step around bodies as if around stones in the road. In such a world, terror became constant, and what is constant eventually transforms. Fear hardened into ritual. Horror learned to wear a mask. It was in this atmosphere that the danse macabre was born. The earliest images appeared in graveyards and cloisters, places already thick with memory. Church walls became stages, and upon them unfolded a procession unlike any seen before. A pope was led by a skeleton with a mocking bow. A king reached for his crown as bony fingers clasped his wrist. Merchants clutched their purses, children their toys, brides their veils. None were spared, all were invited. Death did not drag or strike. It extended a hand, patient and courteous, as if this final dance had always been scheduled. What unsettled viewers was not the message medieval sermons spoke constantly of mortality, but the expression. Death did not roar or loom, it grinned. Its teeth were bare, almost playful. In some murals, the skeletons appeared mid-step, knees bent, spines curved with motion. In others, they played instruments, fiddles, drums, pipes fashioned from bone. The implication was unmistakable. This was not an end. This was a performance. Paris saw one of the earliest and most influential versions painted along the walls of the Cemetery of the Innocents. The dead were already buried beneath the feet of passers-by, stacked in charnel pits, their skulls arranged like architecture. Above them, the danse macabre unfolded in pigment and line. Visible to all who entered the city, it was impossible to avoid. One did not seek it out. One simply walked past and was reminded. Further east, in Basel, another version appeared, stretching along monastery walls. Here, the figures were even more expressive. Death leaned close to whisper into the ears of the living. Kings recoiled, peasants shrugged, monks clasped their hands in prayer to late. The faces of the skeletons were strangely individualized, as if the artist had studied real skulls for too long, memorizing the subtle differences that make even death unique. Why smile at such a moment? This question lingers like smoke in the nave. One answer offered itself easily: instruction. The danse macabre was a sermon for eyes rather than ears, a reminder that all earthly ranks dissolved in the grave. To medieval viewers, steeped in hierarchy, the image was radical. Death treated pope and beggar with identical courtesy. The dance was the great equalizer. In its rhythm, crowns and rags became indistinguishable, yet this explanation feels incomplete. Moral lessons usually carried an edge of warning, a call to repentance. The danse macabre did not plead. It did not threaten. It observed, and in that observation was something unsettlingly calm. Those who stood before the murals at night, when candles flickered and shadows moved, reported sensations difficult to articulate. Some claimed the skeleton seemed to shift, as if the dance continued after the viewer blinked. Others spoke of expressions changing, grins widening, eye sockets deepening. Monks, accustomed to contemplating death, were said to turn away uneasily. The laughter of bones struck the close to something unspoken. Perhaps the smile was not mockery, but familiarity. By the time these images were painted, death had become a constant companion. Families had eaten beside it, slept beside it, watched it carry away children and elders alike. Terror had exhausted itself. What remained was intimacy. The danse macabre may have been the first art to acknowledge this closeness honestly. There is also the possibility of defiance. To paint death as playful was to steal some of its power. Laughter, even skeletal laughter, can disarm fear in transforming annihilation. Into choreography, medieval artists turned chaos into pattern. The dance has steps, the music has tempo, even death must follow the rhythm. Yet not all who encountered these images felt comforted. Some described a creeping sense that the skeletons were enjoying themselves too much. Their grins were not neutral. They suggested knowledge of timing, of inevitability, of secrets the living could not yet hear. Death was not merely equal, It was amused by the illusion that equality had ever been delayed. As centuries passed, attitudes shifted, new doctrines favored restraint, decorum, a softer vision of salvation. The dance macabre, with its blunt honesty, began to feel dangerous. Murals were covered with plaster, frescoes faded beneath whitewash, manuscripts were locked away, their margins trimmed, their pages removed or lost. The dance did not end, it was buried. What survives today are fragments: a hand grasping a sleeve, a skull tilted in mid-laugh, a faded king reaching backward, reluctant even as he follows. These remnants feel more haunting than the complete scenes ever could. They suggest interruption, as if the dance continues just beyond the edge of sight. Standing before these fragments now, one senses the weight of what was never written down. No artist left a confession explaining why the skeleton smiles. No monk recorded the feeling in his chest as he passed beneath those walls each day. The meaning of the dance macabre was never fixed. It lived in the space between terror and acceptance, between warning and surrender, and perhaps that is why it endures. The dance macabre does not promise heaven. It does not dwell on hell. It offers no escape clause, no exception for virtue or power. It simply states a fact. Rendered in bone and gesture, everyone dances eventually. The music may be unheard, but the steps are already learned. In the end, the smile is what lingers. Not cruel, not kind, just patient. A reminder that death does not rush, it waits. It watches generations rise and fall. Grounds pass from head to head, names fade from stone. And when the moment comes, it does not shout, it extends a hand. The medieval world understood this more intimately than we like to remember. In their darkest hour, they painted truth without ornament, and in doing so, they left behind a mirror that still reflects us. The dance has never stopped. We walk alongside it every day, pretending not to hear the music, until one quiet moment when the skeleton turns, smiles, and invites us to join. Before dawn, when the monastery corridors were cold enough to ache in the bones, the altarpiece waited in silence. Its wooden panels were closed, hiding what lay within, as if even painted suffering required restraint. The brothers who tended the sick moved softly past it, their sandals whispering over stone slick with years of prayers and spilled water. Outside, mist clung to the fields like a second skin. Inside, pain breathed when the panels of the Eisenheim altarpiece were finally opened. It was never done lightly, radiant, not serene but broken in a way no image had dared before. This was the early 16th century, on the edge of a medieval world already exhausted by plague, hunger, and disease that rotted flesh while the mind remained awake to feel. The monastery of St. Anthony at Eisenheim was no ordinary house of worship. It was a hospital, a last refuge for those afflicted with ergotism, a sickness that blackened limbs, twisted bodies, and drove sufferers into hallucinations and screams. Men arrived whole and left in pieces, some left only as prayers. The altarpiece was created for them. Christ's body on the cross was greened, bruised, and swollen. His skin stretched tight over bones, blistered and cracked, as though infection itself had claimed him. Thorns pierced not just his brow, but his scalp. His blood thick and dark as it ran in rivulets down his arms. His fingers curled into claws, frozen in the final spasm before breath leaves the body. There was no idealization here, no distance. This was a corpse that still remembered pain. Those who stood before it recognized themselves. The sores that marked Christ's skin mirrored their own lesions. The contorted posture echoed their nightly convulsions. Even the color, the sickly green and gray, matched the flesh of men who had watched their hands decay while still attached to their arms. This was not a savior watching from above. This was a companion hanging beside them, and yet the mystery deepened not in the suffering itself, but in the decision to show it so completely. The artist, Matthias Grunewald, left almost nothing behind in words. His life is fragmented, his personality known only through the violence of his vision. He did not soften the edges. He did not shield the viewer. It is as though he believed that truth, once diluted, ceased to heal. The altarpiece confronts. It does not console gently. It meets agony eye to eye. When the sick were brought into the chapel, some could not look for long. Others wept openly. A few reached out, fingers trembling as if to touch the wounds painted. Before them, records suggest The artist's name was never recorded. Payment records showed that work ceased. Abruptly, no explanation, plaster, their forms incomplete, as if interrupted mid-birth. Rumors followed quickly. Villagers whispered that the painter slept in the church during the final weeks, refusing to return home. Others claimed he spoke to the walls, arguing with figures no one else could see. These stories were never written down officially, but they persisted, passed quietly between generations, gaining weight through repetition. Monks, accustomed to contemplating hell in theory, found the images difficult to endure in practice. One account speaks of a brother who refused to pray beneath a particular arch, claiming the devil painted their changed expression depending on the hour. At dawn, it sneered. At dusk, it smiled. At night, it seemed to wait. Torchlight only made things worse. Flames animated shadows, and the demons appeared to shift subtly, their features deepening, their eyes catching light in a way that felt intentional. No movement could be proven, and yet, those who stood there long enough felt it all the same. Why would a church allow such imagery? The official answer was instruction. Fear, after all, was an effective teacher in an age when few could read. Images carried theology into the body. To see hell was to remember it. To be watched by demons was to measure one's soul more carefully. But this explanation falters when faced with the excess. These devils were not simple warnings. They were too detailed, too expressive, too invested in their own existence. Some displayed curiosity rather than rage. Others seemed amused. A few looked almost sorrowful. This emotional range did not align neatly with doctrine. Hell, as preached, was punishment, not personality. It is possible the artist painted temptation rather than damnation, not monsters to flee from, or reflections of inner thoughts, desires given form. The devil's familiarity supports this idea. They were not alien, they were intimate. They leaned close, they watched. Over time, the discomfort grew. Parents noticed children refusing to look upward during Mass. Confessions lengthened. Dreams grew darker. Whether suggestion or genuine terror, the effect was undeniable. The walls were shaping the inner lives of those who prayed beneath them. Eventually, a decision was made. The frescoes were plastered over, not destroyed, buried. Layer by layer, white lime covered teeth, eyes, horns. The demons disappeared behind silence, sealed into the church like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Official records described the imagery as excessive. No further explanation was offered. For centuries, they slept. When restoration began long after, fragments emerged reluctantly, a jaw here, an eye there, enough to confirm what had once been, but not enough to restore it fully. The devils returned only in pieces, as if refusing resurrection. Those who uncovered them reported a strange reluctance to continue. Work slowed. Some sections were left untouched. Whether out of respect or unease, no one said. What remains today is incomplete, and perhaps that is fitting. The devils of St. Wolfgang were never meant to be admired. They were meant to intrude, to collapse the distance between sin and sinner, between warning and recognition. In hiding them, the church attempted to reclaim control over the narrative of fear, but something was lost in the covering. The frescoes had confronted an uncomfortable truth, that belief is not always gentle, and that terror often wears a human face. Standing in the church now, one feels the absence more sharply than the presence. Blank walls carry echoes. The imagination feels what the eye cannot see, and perhaps that was always the point. The devils were not painted to frighten people away from sin. They were painted to suggest that sin was already close, already watching. In that way, St. Wolfgang's demons remain effective even in silence. They linger beneath the plaster, frozen in half-formed expressions, waiting, not to leap out, not to attack, but to remind anyone who stands beneath those walls that the line between the sacred and the damned has always been thinner than stone. The page was never empty, even before ink touched parchment, before the quill dipped and trembled. The margins waited. They were pale fields of possibility, wide enough for silence, narrow enough for secrets. Medieval scribes were trained to believe that every word copied was an act of devotion, every letter of prayer shaped by the hand. Yet when their eyes drifted away from the sacred text, when the psalm ended, when the gospel paused, something else began to surface. It crept in from the edges. In the long hours of copying, beneath vaulted ceilings and flickering candles, monks and scribes filled books meant for God with images that seemed to come from elsewhere. Not from heaven, not entirely from hell, but from a place where the mind wandered when discipline faltered and imagination slipped its leash. They called them marginalia. but that name feels too gentle. Along the borders of medieval manuscripts, grotesque figures began to appear. Knights charged not dragons, but snails slow, eyeless creatures rendered enormous and triumphant. Rabbits marched upright, swords raised, executing men with unsettling calm. Hybrid beings fused human faces to animal bodies, their mouths open, in silent screams or crooked laughter. Heads detached from bodies rolled across the page, sprouting legs, biting one another, staring outward as if aware of being watched. The central text remained holy, psalms, gospels, legal codes. The words of God and kings alike marched in careful columns, and yet wrapped around them. Like ivy around stone, chaos flourished. The setting in which these books were made was one of control. Monasteries were governed by bells and schedules. Silence was enforced. Desire was discipline. Imagination was suspect, and yet the margins tell another story of quiet rebellion conducted in ink so fine. It escaped immediate notice. Why here? Why in books meant for prayer and lauded the strangest? Visions find refuge. One explanation is fatigue. Scribes worked for hours, sometimes days. Bent over desks, their world reduced to lines and curves. The hand obeyed long after the mind wandered. In this wandering, the grotesque emerged like a dream slipping into waking life. But this does not explain the repetition. The same motifs appear across regions and decades, copied with intention. These were not accidents of boredom. Others argue satire. The margins mock authority, invert power, laugh at seriousness, rabbits defeating hunters, snails overcoming knights. The mighty made ridiculous. In a rigid society, such reversals offered quiet relief, laughter, even silent laughter, was survival. And yet, some images resist humor entirely. There are faces in the margins that do not smile. Creatures whose eyes are too detailed, too focused, mouths stretched not in jest, but in anguish. Figures that seem to crawl toward the reader, breaking the boundary between page and world. These images linger longer than jokes. They disturb. In certain manuscripts, the marginal figures grow darker as the text grows holier. Near the Psalms, demons cluster thickly. Near the Passion, bodies twist unnaturally. It is as if the closer the scribe came to divine mystery, the more the subconscious pushed back, flooding the edges with unease. Some scholars believe the margins were spaces of confession, a place where thoughts forbidden in the main text could emerge without words. If the center of the page was order, the margin was truth unfiltered, unapproved. There are cases where marginalia seems to respond directly to the text it surrounds. A sermon on humility bordered by grotesque faces swollen with pride. A passage on temptation accompanied by creatures offering fruit with clawed hands. The dialogue is silent but precise. Image speaks to word without permission. And then there are the watchers. In several manuscripts, figures in the margins turn their gaze outward, toward the reader. They do not interact with the text. They observe. Their eyes are often exaggerated. Night, when the candle burned low and shadows moved across vellum, must have been deeply unsettling. The book no longer felt passive. It looked back. Not all scribes signed their work. Many names were lost, intentionally omitted as acts of humility. But in some manuscripts, marginal figures appear beside the final lines, as if marking completion. A face peers out, half-formed, mouth open in others. The drawings become frantic near the end lines, jagged, forms distorted, as though the act of copying itself had strained something fragile. There are instances where scribes disappeared from records. After completing particularly dense marginal work, no scandal is recorded, no punishment noted, only absence. Whether coincidence or consequence remains unknown. Church authorities were aware of marginalia, but rarely addressed it directly. Perhaps they saw it as harmless. Perhaps they did not look closely, or perhaps they understood that some pressures, once released quietly, were safer than those forced into silence. Because these images were not public, they were seen only by those who read, by mouths scraped into silence, noses flattened by repeated blows. Haloed figures remained standing in full color, robes intact, gestures frozen in blessing, but their faces were gone. These were the faceless saints of Catalonia. The mutilations appeared gradually, scattered across valleys and mountain villages. Yet unmistakably deliberate, each damaged image bore the same restraint. The walls were not smashed, the bodies were not defaced. Only the face, the point of recognition, the place where the human meets the divine, was destroyed. To stand before them was to feel the weight of a choice made long ago and never explained. The churches themselves date to the early medieval period, when Christianity was still negotiating space with older beliefs rooted in land, stone, and shadow. Saints were not distant abstractions, they were neighbors, guardians, intermediaries. Their painted eyes watched births, deaths, marriages, and confessions. Their faces were known as intimately as living ones, and that intimacy may have become unbearable. Local records offer little clarity. No edicts survive ordering destruction, no trials, no confessions. The silence is as precise as the damage itself. Whatever fear or belief drove the hands that scraped away those faces did not seek justification in writing. It was acted upon and then left behind. Some scholars point to waves of iconoclasm periods when images were seen as dangerous, distractions from true worship, but iconoclasm usually destroys broadly, violently. Here, the destruction was surgical. A saint's blessing hand might remain, delicately painted, fingers curved with care, while the face above it was erased beyond recognition. This was not rage, it was caution. Others suggest superstition. In rural Catalonia, belief did not always align neatly with doctrine. Images were thought to see, to judge, to intervene. A saint's gaze could bless or curse. There are whispers of villagers who believed painted eyes followed them home, who felt watched even in sleep. Removing the face may have been an act of protection, not defiance, a way to silence what saw too much. In some churches, the defacement clusters around particular figures, saints associated with judgment, with plague, with sudden death. Their bodies remain upright and commanding, but their faces are voids. As if their authority had to be severed at the source, the setting amplifies the unease. These churches are small, their interiors narrow, light enters reluctantly, filtered through slits of stone. When one steps inside, the faceless figures emerge slowly from shadow. At first, they appear intact, then the absence becomes clear, where expression should be. There is only rough plaster, scraped unevenly, sometimes down to bare stone. The violence is still visible in the texture. Some faces were removed repeatedly. Traces of paint beneath scratches suggest earlier restorations followed by renewed destruction. This cycle implies persistence. Whatever fear or conviction motivated the act did not fade easily, it returned. What makes the mystery deeper is restraint in what was left untouched. Halos remain luminous. Backgrounds retain their symbolic colors. In some cases, inscriptions naming the saint survive beneath the blank space where the face once was. The saint is still named, still acknowledged yet denied presence. To erase a face while keeping the name is to separate identity from recognition. The saint exists, but cannot be seen. Standing before these images, one feels an inversion of devotion. Medieval worship relied heavily on seeing. Faith was mediated through image. To remove the face was to break that mediation, to refuse intimacy. It suggests that belief had crossed a threshold, from comfort into fear. There is another possibility, quieter and harder to prove. Some historians believe the defacement may have been done by the faithful themselves during moments of crisis. Plague, famine, invasion were equally in shadow, in silence, in what is carried rather than displayed, in her darkness. She holds contradiction, mother and monument, comfort and confrontation. The Black Madonna watches without judgment, but not without awareness. Her gaze does not follow, it waits. It invites reflection rather than response. To kneel before her is not to ask for escape, but to acknowledge what already is. In this way, she became a companion to those who live with grief as a constant presence. She did not promise the end of suffering. She promised that suffering was seen, and so she remains in crypts and mountain shrines carved from dark wood, painted in tones that absorb light. She refuses explanation. She refuses transformation. She is not an anomaly to be solved, but a presence to be encountered. In the end, the Black Madonna does not haunt because she is dark. She haunts because she remembers. She remembers every hand that reached for her in desperation, every prayer whispered in fear, every night spent hoping for dawn. She holds all of it without blinking, and in that unwavering stillness, she offers a truth medieval faith understood deeply and modern minds struggle to accept. That holiness is not always bright, and comfort is not always warm. Sometimes, the most sacred thing is simply the strength to remain unmoving, unilluminated, and present while the world suffers around you. The church smelled of dust and damp stone, even after centuries of care. Sunlight pierced the narrow windows in shards, striking the floor in pale rectangles. And in those beams, the frescoes of the apocalyptic vision seemed to stir. They were not meant to be gentle. They were never meant for comfort. They were warnings, songs of despair, carved and painted to haunt, to teach, and, perhaps most disturbingly, to linger in the mind long after the candles were extinguished. This was the world of the Last Judgment frescoes, most famously executed in the Gothic period along cathedral walls from Germany to Italy. In particular, the Cathedral of St. Vitus in Prague and the Church of San Lorenzo in Tuscany bore images so vast and intricate that one could spend hours tracing the torment without ever reaching the edge. Entire walls became theaters of divine wrath, the heavens above crowded with angels and saints, the earth below overrun with the damned. And yet, amid this grand cosmic panorama, the artists chose to dwell in the intimate. They painted not just mass suffering, but the minutiae of individual terror. Every figure was unique. One man writhed, his mouth open in a silent scream as a demon dragged him toward a pit. Another clasped at his chest, eyes wide, pleading with a god who seemed both near and impossibly distant. In a corner, a small child tried to flee the judgment, only to be encircled by the scaly tail of a dragon-like creature. These were not generic horrors. These were witnesses to human fragility rendered in exquisite detail, as if the painters had peered closely at the souls of their contemporaries. The artists worked in an era when the threat of plague, famine, and war hung over every village and town. Death was not a metaphor, it was a daily companion. And in these frescoes, it was immortalized in flame and shadow, in the gnarled fingers of demons and the glint of knives and chains. Yet amid the terror, there was artistry that unsettled even further the choice of expression. Some damned smiled, eyes glinting with recognition or mockery, as if even in suffering they retained awareness. Others looked resigned, their posture calm in the face of annihilation. Pain and awareness, agony and stillness were entwined. The mystery of the Last Judgment imagery lies not merely in its scale or technical mastery, but in its psychological depth. Why depict the damned with such individuality? Why allow moments of eerie humanity amid fire and chaos? Perhaps the artist intended to remind the living of the universality of sin and death, the equality of judgment, or perhaps they were recording visions seen in fevered dreams, hallucinations of plague-stricken nights, or confessions whispered loudly in empty churches. In some places, these frescoes were whitewashed or destroyed, deemed disturbing, too honest. But those that survived carry the same unsettling power as when they were first unveiled. The gaze of the damned, the sly smile of demons, the solemnity of the saints they press against the viewer even now, centuries later, and insist upon recognition. Standing before such a wall, one understands the fragile boundary between art and ritual, between warning and obsession. The fresco does not merely depict judgment, it enacts it, drawing the observer into the eternal theater, a silent participant in the fate of all souls. And in that drawn-out stillness, one realizes that medieval faith often sought to teach not through comfort, but through confrontation, leaving its lessons etched in fire, shadow, and the human imagination. The Last Judgment is not just a painting, it is a voice from the past, a whisper of terror and awe, and a reminder that even in stone and pigment, mortality can smile, scowl, plead, and endure. And as the sun fades and the candlelight trembles, the frescoes seem to breathe, keeping watch over all who dare to look along. The abbey was silent long before dawn, but the silence was thick with memory. Stone carters held shadows that seemed older than the building itself, curling around arches and slipping beneath doors. Within the nave, the air smelled faintly of candle soot and decayed incense, as though centuries of worship had left a residue too subtle to remove. There, on walls and ceilings, angels no longer smiled, they stared, and between them, the damned writhed. But more unsettling than saints or sinners were the creatures who moved between worlds. The grotesque of medieval manuscript-inspired murals brought to life in pigment and plaster. In the north of France, in a small, overlooked abbey near Rouen, an artist worked in the early 15th century to decorate the cloister. His frescoes were remarkable, not for their technical precision, but for their devotion to the absurd, the grotesque, and the unnerving, human forms twisted to broad, head to large, giving him an air of being more symbolic than literal. The quiet persistence of a presence, too small to be ignored and too haunting to be explained. In the stillness of that ancient stone chamber, one cannot help but feel the weight of centuries pressing lightly upon the soul. The child martyr, though nameless, speaks across time not with words, but with attention, and in that attention lies a lesson as eternal as the chapel itself. That witness, even silent, is a form of sacred endurance, and that remembrance is perhaps the truest prayer of all. The abbey sat isolated atop a wind-swept plateau, its spires reaching toward a sky perpetually gray, where clouds scuttled like restless spirits. Inside, the air was thick with a lingering scent of incense, smoke curling in slow, deliberate spirals, settling on stone and fresco alike. It was here, along the northern walls of the choir, that one of the most unsettling images of the medieval imagination took form. The weeping angels, carved and painted in uncanny detail, weeping not for sin, but for the weight of the world itself. These angels appear across several European frustration, imagination, or perhaps personal torment. They painted sorrow itself, giving it shape, weight, and consciousness in the centuries since. Attempts were made to restore or lighten the murals. Faded pigments were refreshed, cracks filled, but the essence remained untouchable. One cannot alter grief without diminishing its meaning, and the weeping angels remained stubbornly authentic, holding vigil over the abbey, over the faithful, and over the centuries of suffering that passed beneath their gaze. To enter their presence is to feel both observed and understood. They do not speak, but the tears, the gaze, the hands they communicate an enduring truth, that sorrow is eternal, that the divine is capable of mourning, and that the human condition is inseparable from pain. And as candlelight flickers across their faces, elongating shadows and emphasizing the curve of each tear, one cannot help but feel that the weeping angels of St. Gilles are not merely art, but companions of history itself, silent, eternal, and unbearably aware. The forest grew dense long before the abbey itself was built, a tangle of oak and yew whose roots twisted beneath stone and soil, hiding secrets older than memory. Within this living cathedral, monks carved out a small chapel, its walls damp, its roof low, its windows mere slits allowing shards of sunlight to pierce the gloom. It was in this shadowed place, during the late 14th century, that one of the most enigmatic images of medieval devotion appeared, the Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre, rendered in pigment across plastered walls with a precision that unsettled even the most pious observers. The murals depicted a procession unlike any other. Skeletons white as bone, hollow-eyed and grinning, moved deliberately through towns and villages of painted citizens. Kings and peasants, bishops and beggars, children and merchants alike were clasped by decaying hands, drawn inexorably into a final, mocking waltz. Their faces were painted with intent, expressions ranging from terror to absurd acceptance. The living did not lead, they were led. Death, in its skeletal elegance, dictated the steps. The Black Death had swept through Europe not long before these images appeared. Entire towns vanished beneath its invisible breath. Graves multiplied faster than builders could manage, and the collective memory of loss weighed heavily upon every hand that held a brush. The murals were both reflection and instruction, a grim reminder that mortality levels all distinctions. But what unsettled observers most was the tone. These skeletons did not only terrify, they seemed amused. Some danced with laughter frozen on their decayed faces. Others gestured politely, as though inviting onlookers to join the procession, to step into the rhythm that would claim all. The mystery lies not in their existence, but in their intimacy. Unlike the distant horrors of hell or the abstract depictions of judgment, the Dance of Death brought mortality into homes, marketplaces, and churches. One could walk along the nave and feel the bony hand of death rest upon the shoulder of the painted merchant, a tactile awareness of human fragility rendered in pigment. Visitors swore that, in flickering candlelight, the skeleton seemed to shift slightly, tilting heads or gesturing more directly toward those present. Some whispered that the images were created after fevered dreams, visions of plague and loss, that the painter sought to give form to before they vanished. Many of these murals were whitewashed in later centuries, deemed too unsettling, too honest for new generations of worshippers. Those that survive are often fragmented, with hollow eyes peering from chipped plaster, mid-step or mid-laugh, frozen in eternity. Scholars debate whether the amusement painted onto the faces of death was satire, psychological coping, or a deeper ritual understanding that to mock mortality was to claim a small measure of power over it. The Dance of Death endures because it refuses comfort. It reminds us that equality in death is not just inevitable, it is intimate. The skeletal hands that grasp kings and beggars alike hold nothing with cruelty. They hold with inevitability, with playfulness, with the quiet certainty that no social rank, no wealth, no virtue will spare a single step. To stand before the mural today, even in fragments, is to feel the pulse of centuries, the heartbeat of those who once lived in fear and awe of mortality. Death smiles, yes, but not maliciously. It smiles because it has been patient for eternity. And in its patience lies both invitation and warning. The dance continues, unseen and unending, and the living have only yet to take their turn. In that muted chapel, where light falls thin and shadows cling to corners, one understands that the Dance Macabre is more than art. It is a meditation, a mirror, and a challenge. It asks not that we fear, but that we recognize. It asks that we see ourselves, briefly and intimately, as all the world has always seen us, mortal, fleeting, and ever part of the dance that waits. The crypt was damp and narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to pass without brushing against the cold, uneven stones. The air smelled of earth, mildew, and centuries of incense, thick enough to taste. Here, in this forgotten corner of a medieval monastery in northern Germany, a fresco unfolded across the wall, a vision of terror rendered not in grand strokes, but in meticulous detail, each figure small, each action deliberate, as if the painter sought to trap the observer in a perpetual state of unease. This was the procession of the dead, a cousin of the dance macabre, yet more intimate, more precise, more personal. It depicted not kings and merchants in the wide spaces of city life, but individuals caught in their final moments, a mother clutching her infant, a knight collapsing mid-stride, a beggar frozen in surprise as skeletal hands emerged from the earth. To seize him, every death was unique, every expression meticulously rendered, and always, somewhere in the composition, a skeleton watched, smiled, or gestured, commanding the scene with an authority that was absolute. The era that gave rise to these murals was one of relentless mortality. Plague had swept through Europe in waves, leaving towns empty, bell towers echoing with silence. Wars drained the land of men, famine starved the living, and superstition filled every shadow. In such times, death was not a distant abstraction, but a constant companion. The fresco did not merely reflect this reality, it enforced to see themselves among the fallen, even as they gazed upward in devotion. What is striking and disturbing about this particular fresco is the subtlety of its horror. The dead are not monstrous. They are precise, almost polite in their grim purpose. A skeleton tilts its skull toward the kneeling parishioner, as if making eye contact. A decayed hand rests gently on his shoulder, guiding, not dragging. The viewer feels implicated, drawn into the rhythm of inevitability, a participant in a ritual that is unending and impartial. The painter's intent remains a mystery. Some suggest these images were moral lessons, reminders of the equality of sin and death. Others whisper of visions, fevered dreams inspired by plagues, or even of psychological necessity, coping mechanisms for artists confronting mortality daily. Yet despite centuries of scholarly debate, nothing explains fully why the skeletal figures are so unnervingly human in gesture and expression. They are neither caricature nor pure allegory. They are a mirror held to the soul, showing both fear and recognition. Over time, many of the procession murals were whitewashed or covered as taste shifted and the church sought to sanitize imagery deemed visceral for worship. Yet fragments remain barely visible, chipped, faded but enough to unsettle. Torchlight cast shifting shadows across the decayed hands, the hollow eyes, and the frozen steps, as if the fresco itself breathed with a quiet persistence. To stand in that crypt today is to feel the weight of centuries of observation, prayer, and fear. The dead are patient. They smile, they wait, and in that waiting lies a lesson both simple and unbearable. The dance of life and death continues, indifferent to rank, piety, or desire. In their silent procession, one sees a truth that medieval Europe knew intimately and that we, even now, can only glimpse, that mortality is both democratic and inevitable, and that art, in its darkest forms, preserves not beauty, but memory, warning, and the unflinching gaze of eternity. As the candle flickers and shadows stretch along the stone, the skeletal hands seem to move again, and in the stillness of the crypt, one realizes that the procession is not merely on the wall, it has been waiting for centuries, and its invitation remains unanswered. The monastery perched on a craggy hill above the Loire, its silhouette jagged against the morning mist, as though the stones themselves had grown in rebellion against the sky. Inside, the scriptorium was quiet, a cathedral of light filtered through narrow windows, dust motes drifting in suspended motion. Here, in the hands of an unknown illuminator during the early 15th century, the beastly choir emerged, a series of marginal illustrations in a devotional manuscript that was otherwise solemn and orderly, yet along the edges chaos whispered. At first glance, the marginalia appeared whimsical, small animals dancing, rabbits wielding swords, foxes in clerical robes. Yet upon closer inspection, one noticed the meticulous attention to anatomy, the precision of gesture, and the unsettling awareness in the eyes of the creatures. They were not mere decoration. Each figure seemed to observe the page, the scribe, and even the reader, existing simultaneously within and beyond the text. Some scholars suggest these marginalia were a form of satire, a playful inversion of societal hierarchies, snails defeating knights, monkeys mocking priests. Others argue for psychological release, a subconscious rebellion against rigid monastic life, expressed in ink and parchment. But in the beastly choir, the humor carries a dark undertone. One rabbit, painted mid-leap with a dagger in its paw, pierces the side of a man sprawled across a manuscript border. A hybrid creature, half lion, half bird, tilts its head toward the viewer, mouth open in a silent scream or laughter, impossible to tell which. Observers centuries later have reported feelings of unease when tracing these figures, an inexplicable sense that the creatures are aware, anticipating movement, responding to attention. The scribe, bent over for hours in candlelight, may have imbued them with the rhythm of his own breath and heartbeat, embedding consciousness into pigment. The placement of these illustrations amplifies their strangeness. Figures inhabit corners where light and shadow interact unpredictably, wrapping around margins and stretching along lines of text. Some extend impossibly into the written word itself, as though the creatures were interacting with scripture. Bending sacred order into something uncanny, there's a deliberate tension, a constant push and pull between the holiness of the text and the absurdity of the margins. The viewer is caught between devotion and curiosity, reverence and dread. The mystery deepens when considering the audience. These manuscripts were rarely public. They were read privately by monks or select laypersons. The scribe's marginalia would not entertain a crowd. It existed as a private dialogue, an intimate joke, or a confession written in ink. Yet despite its hidden nature, the effect is profound. Modern viewers report a creeping sense of life within these creatures, a haunting awareness that transcends centuries. Some manuscripts bear repeated patterns of these grotesques, indicating intentionality beyond whimsy, faces contorted in pain or glee, hybrid forms twisting unnaturally, all executed with painstaking care. The more one studies the margins, the more one suspects a rhythm or narrative hidden beneath layers of absurdity, a secret story, known only to the artist and perhaps to those who dared read at night, under candlelight. When the manuscripts were later rebound or trimmed, many creatures were lost, severed mid-action, leaving only fragments. Yet even these remnants maintain their uncanny vitality. A single rabbit paw, a twisted human leg, an eye staring from the corner of a page. These fragments are enough to unsettle the imagination. The scribe's presence lingers, a faint echo across time, a whisper that life, devotion, and absurdity coexist in ways both beautiful and disturbing. Despair stretches infinitely. Unlike other depictions of hell, which place the damned in neat compartments or symbolic layers, this helmet collapses space, suggesting an unbroken, continuous descent. One cannot locate a beginning or an end. There is only movement, inevitability, and the yawning hunger that devours all. The mystery lies in the subtle interplay between horror and fascination. Why does the image captivate centuries later? Perhaps it is the precision the way agony is rendered with an almost delicate care, the way fire flickers in pigment, the way despair is individualized. Or perhaps it is the artist's understanding of human psychology, the terror that draws the gaze, compels reflection, and leaves a lingering echo in the mind long after candles are extinguished. Later generations attempted to cover, whitewash, or soften these images. Many fragments survived, worn by moisture and centuries of prayer, yet the essential terror remained intact. The gaping maw, the twisted limbs, the gaze of the damned all endure, a testament to the artist's mastery over both form and fear. Standing before the helmet today, the observer experiences a profound tension. One is repelled and compelled at once, drawn into the space where art and psychology merge. The fresco is not merely representation, it is participation. It demands recognition of mortality, of guilt, of human fragility, and in doing so, it preserves a medieval truth that fear, rendered in detail and with imagination, becomes a bridge across centuries, allowing the dead, the damned, and the living to meet briefly in shadow and stone. And as candlelight trembles across the apse, one cannot help but sense the silent maw waiting still, not just for the painted figures, but for every observer who dares to linger, reminding us that some fears are eternal, and some art, once created, continues its claim long after the hand that made it has returned to dust. The abbey rose from the valley floor like a scar upon the earth, its towers jagged and unfinished, the stones darkened by centuries of rain and soot. Within its walls, the murals of the tortured choir twisted across the nave in silent horror. Unlike depictions of the damned consigned to hell or the grotesque annex of marginalia, these images focused entirely on human agony, a litany of suffering, rendered with painstaking attention to every contorted muscle, every stretched sinew, every expression of despair. The frescoes were created during the late 14th century, at the height of the Black Death, when mortality pressed close to every village and monastery. Entire communities had been erased, families swept from existence, and faith was both a refuge and a burden. In this context, the artist chose not to hide from death, but to confront it, to portray the human body in extremity as both a subject of horror and a vessel of moral instruction. Figures writhed under invisible hands, tied or bound, pulled by demons or unseen forces, their faces twisted in silent screams that time could not silence. The psychological impact of these murals was profound. Parishioners described physical sensations while Or they continue to draw attention, even fascination, precisely because they offer no comfort, no explanation, only presence. In their quiet watchfulness, they preserve an unbroken chain of observation, witnessing centuries of human faith, fear, and endurance. To stand in the cloister today is to feel their weight. Candlelight flickers, shadows stretch across the veils, and the silence hums with the echo of centuries of contemplation. The veiled martyrs do not move, do not speak, and yet they watch, bearing witness to all who enter. And in that watchfulness, one understands a medieval truth, that holiness need not be radiant to be commanding, that suffering need not be voiced to be acknowledged, and that some presences endure through shadow, quiet, and eternity itself. The chapel clung to the edge of the cliff, its stones weathered and blackened by wind and salt, overlooking a river that moved like a ribbon of silver in the morning light. Inside, the walls were alive with shadows and pigment, yet none so unsettling as the depiction of the saint who smiled at death. It was an image that defied expectation, a small figure rendered with delicate brushstrokes yet imbued with an intensity that drew the eye and refused to release it. The saint was shown in the midst of execution, bound to a stake with flames licking the base, or flayed alive in the torment reserved for the most sacred martyrs. Yet the face, the very center of human focus, bore a serene, almost imperceptible smile, lips curved gently, eyes calm and luminous, as if the agony of flesh had no power over the spirit within. Around the saint, Within its stone halls, where torchlight flickered and shadows pooled in corners, one chamber bore a fresco so haunting that even centuries later it unsettles the imagination. The king who never died, unlike the saints, martyrs, or anonymous figures that filled the chapels and abbeys of medieval Europe. This painting depicted a ruler whose eyes seemed to follow the living, whose smile suggested knowledge of secrets no one should hold, and whose body, though draped in royal finery, bore the subtle markers of decay. The image is thought to have been created in the late 14th century, a time when kings wielded absolute authority, yet faced plagues, uprisings, and the slow erosion of their dynasties. The figure of the king is seated upon a throne carved into the wall itself, a throne entwined with serpentine vines and spectral faces, perhaps the remnants of those who challenged him, or those whom fate claimed beneath his reign. His scepter points outward, as though directing not a kingdom, but destiny itself, while his gaze meets every observer with an unsettling awareness. What makes the fresco extraordinary is its liminality. The king is neither fully alive nor entirely dead. His robes are rich in detail, gold leaf catching the torchlight even now, but his hands are skeletal beneath the fabric, his skin drawn taut and pale, and the shadow of rot clings to the edges of his form. Medieval observers described a dissonance, awe at the king's majesty, fear of the evidence of decay, and a creeping recognition that the power he wielded could not protect him or them from the inevitability of mortality. Legends grew around the painting. Courtiers and monks whispered that the artist had glimpsed the king's death in a fevered vision, or that the king himself had commanded his likeness to be preserved. In anticipation of his own demise, some claimed that when the hall was empty, the eyes of the fresco seemed to shift, following movement along the stone floor, a spectral sentience that denied the passage of centuries. Others swore that on stormy nights, a soft laugh emanated from the walls, the voice of a monarch who had outlasted life itself. The fresco may have served as a warning, a meditation, or a private fascination, but it endures as one of the most enigmatic pieces of medieval art. Its ambiguity, the dance between life and death, majesty and decay, presence and absence, ensures that it cannot be reduced to simple moral instruction or historical documentation. It exists instead as a bridge across time, connecting the fears and obsessions of the past to the imagination of the present. Standing before the king who never died, the observer feels the weight of centuries pressing lightly against the skin, hears the echoes of whispered rumors, and senses the stillness of stone that has witnessed both triumph and decay. The figure is eternal in its ambiguity, commanding yet decayed, regal yet intimate. In the stillness of that chamber, one recognizes a medieval truth that transcends time.